to see you here tonight at the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. We are looking behind us, of course, at our library, which right now is completely empty. All the furniture is out of it. Starting next week, some of those floorboards are going to be carefully taken up so that the contractors can begin to install electrical wiring, so that we will actually, when you come back in early November, will be able to plug in your computer or your device. You can be crazy and say, I'm going to go to the Athenaeum and attend virtually one of their noontime programs while you're working at the Athenaeum. So we can't wait till this project is finished. If you are interested in learning more about the interior renovations that are going on, please email Tess or I after the program. We're happy to set you up for a virtual tour, or for an actual tour that we're releasing hard hat tours. If you want to help support the project, please let us know. We have a $1.5 million capital campaign. But in the meantime, we're also so thrilled you are here to join us at the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. We are a community that has been around for more than 200 years, that is focused on books and literature, the built environment, history, the world, and more than anything, bringing people together in community to discuss all of this and how it matters for our lives, and for our city and the places where we live. And if you are interested in being a member or not a member, we would love to have you join us as part of our community that is growing by the day. Tonight, I am really excited for tonight's program, which hits close to home for all of us, about Eastern State Penitentiary and its history. And our guest is Dr. Ashley Rubin, who comes to us from the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. She is an associate professor of sociology there. She holds her PhD in Jurisprudence and Social Policy. We found out that we're both from wine country in California. So anybody who's from the wine country has to be great person as far as I'm concerned. So we're so thrilled to have you here, Ashley. She's the author not only of the Deviant Prison, which I have to tell you I have checked out, but I will get it back into circulation as soon as possible. If you are interested in checking it out, please email Jill and let her know, and then she can bug me to hurry up and finish using it so you can have it. But it's also through Cambridge University Press if you would like to buy and own your own copy. We are so thrilled to have Dr. Rubin with us tonight for this conversation. I invite you to put questions you have anytime during her talk into the Q&A or the chat, and I will moderate those at the end. And so thrilled to have you all here. Invite you to join me in a virtual welcome of Dr. Ashley Rubin to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I'm starting my timer. I am just absolutely thrilled to be speaking with you all tonight. So thank you for spending your dinner hour with me. There's an interesting tie-in to the Athenaeum. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that but anyway, there's an interesting tie-in that will come up at some point. But I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so I want to start by setting the scene for basically everything that I'm going to talk about. So I want to start with this roughly 50-year period of intense penal reform, basically starting before the American Revolution, but really taking off after the American Revolution. So over the course of the 18th century, in colonial America, but also across the Atlantic, there's a growing discomfort with both capital and corporal punishments, which at the time are our go-to punishments. These are basically our main punishments. We didn't have incarceration as a punishment at this time, but people are increasingly unnerved by our use of executions and these painful physical punishments for a variety of reasons. And this really, again, takes up steam after the American Revolution and intersects with another movement, which is the jail reform movement that also had been kind of in the process in the 18th century, but really picked up during and after the American Revolution. And as a product of these two movements, in the 1780s and 1790s, we get the first institutions that we, as contemporary Americans, would recognize as prisons. So this is our first ever prisons, and they happen in the new United States. And I refer to these as proto-prisons because they're still not quite as similar to what we have today. They're kind of more reformed colonial jails, but they're for the first time state institutions, state prisons in the United States. These last for a couple of decades, and then they're replaced in the 1820s with the second generation of prisons, what were called at the time modern prisons. And these are kind of even more similar to what we have today. In fact, many of them are still around. And these are the first cellular prisons, meaning people are in cells. So there are two versions of modern prisons at this time. So one is, it was pioneered in upstate New York at Auburn State Prison. And it's variously called the silent system, the Congregate system, or the Auburn system. And it's basically characterized by prisoners working together in these large factory-like rooms during the day, and then going to solitary cells, very small solitary cells at night. And throughout the whole time of their confinement, they're not allowed to speak to one another or look at one another. And in fact, when they're going to and from their cells and to the factory floor, they would have to march in this kind of lockstep, this kind of shuffle march. And that was kind of intended to prevent people from being able to speak with each other because they had to concentrate on this march. This is also, as far as I can tell, the origin of the striped uniforms that's so kind of central to our idea of what prisoners, how they're dressed. So those stripes, that becomes really popular in the late 19th century and the 20th century, has its origins here at Auburn. The other approach to incarceration is known as the Pennsylvania system, or oftentimes the separate system. And under the separate system, prisoners were held in their cells for the duration of their confinement. So they would live their lives in their cells, but living their life meant they would work, they would do craft style labor inside their cells, so shoemaking, cabinet making, that sort of thing, weaving. They would study, they would learn to read and write, and they would have their, essentially their religious exercises in their cells. And they did have access to a small kind of garden or yard attached to their cell that was just for them. But basically they would live their life in their cell or in that little attached yard for the duration. And there's a very big emphasis on protecting the privacy of the prisoners and preventing the prisoners in the Pennsylvania system from speaking with one another or seeing one another. And they didn't even want the guards to see the prisoners. And so at least in theory, anytime a prisoner had to leave their cell, such as to go to the hospital building on the campus of the prison, they would have to wear these kind of outfits to protect their identity so that they wouldn't be seen or kind of recognized by anyone. They would also be known by their numbers rather than their names, again, to protect their privacy so they could leave the prison basically undaunted or unharmed by this kind of stigma of their incarceration after they've left. And that was pioneered at the flagship prison of the Pennsylvania system, Eastern State Penitentiary, right there in Philadelphia. So these are the two models of incarceration that were available for modern prisons starting in the 1820s, but they weren't equally popular. So this is a map of the United States as it existed in 1821. The light gray jurisdictions are states that were in the Union, and the dark gray jurisdictions are territories that are not yet states. And so you can kind of see what the United States looked like at the time. And they've colored in the state of New York, signifying that New York has adopted a modern prison. It's the first one to do so. And it's adopted it on the Auburn system. So in this map, blue means a modern prison on the Auburn system. By 1840, the modern prison had been adopted from coast to, or sorry, not coast to coast, from coast to the frontier, and in the north as well as in the south. So basically across the country, no major regional differences. It's been adopted very widely, but most of the modern prisons that have been adopted are adopted on the Auburn system specifically. Only 3 states at this point adopted the Pennsylvania system: Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. By 1860, 1 year before the American Civil War, the prison has spread further, as has the country. We now have prisons from coast to coast, but now we're only down to 1 state using the Pennsylvania system. Everywhere else, the Auburn system has been adopted as the model for the modern prison that each state has adopted. And at this point, almost every state has adopted the modern prison. I'll note that Florida, for example, has a very small population, as does Delaware at this point, so it didn't quite make sense for them to adopt a modern prison. And Oregon had just become a member of the Union about a year before. And eventually both of these places also adopted modern prisons as well. By 1866, the map basically hasn't changed, but Eastern State Penitentiary is now the only prison using the Pennsylvania system. So back in 1860, 1840, and so on, the Pennsylvania system existed at another prison, Western State Penitentiary, right outside of Pittsburgh in Allegheny County. But by 1866, the administrators of that prison said, no more, we're not following the Pennsylvania system. So now we're just down to Eastern State Penitentiary. And kind of throughout this entire period, Eastern State Penitentiary is really the flagship prison of the Pennsylvania system, and basically a lightning rod for criticism. So the two different types of prisons, these two competing systems of what they called prison discipline, the kind of style of prison, was intensely debated throughout the 19th century. And in fact, this was something that was fairly widely debated. It wasn't just for like a fringe group of people. It was something that essentially social elites, but also some ordinary people in society were deeply interested in. So on the left, I have just a sampling of pamphlets that were circulated across the Atlantic, especially in the United States, but also in England, as well as a couple of other countries, of people weighing in on the debate about which system is better, or what should we be doing for our prisons, how should they be designed, how should they be implemented, and so on. An important player in this debate that I want to highlight is the Boston Prison Discipline Society, which was founded in 1826. They were later joined by the New York Prison Association, and they're also coming after the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, which is a forerunner. So we have all these penal reform societies, as well as individuals interested in the question of penal reform. But the Boston Prison Discipline Society is important for the account I'm about to give, because they were especially critical of the Pennsylvania system, especially at Eastern State Penitentiary. So they argued, and I should also note that they didn't pioneer these critiques. These were actually they were essentially summarizing the critiques, but they were especially vehement in their criticism of the prison. So they basically propagated these 4 critiques that were fairly standard at the time. So these 4 critiques were this idea that the Pennsylvania system is cruel and inhumane because it's using solitary confinement, especially long-term solitary confinement. They argued man is a social creature. It's cruel to keep them from social intercourse. They also argued that solitary confinement is dangerous to people's mental and physical health, that putting people in small cells or even somewhat large cells, in the case of Eastern State Penitentiary, for long periods of time is going to result in mental decompensation and a greater propensity to physical illness and potentially death. They also argued that the Pennsylvania system was overly expensive, especially to build and to maintain. So because the Pennsylvania system required these fairly large cells, even by today's standards, but especially in comparison to the Auburn system, that you needed essentially bigger prisons and especially bigger cells, which were more expensive to build than the Auburn system prisons. And then related to this, they also argued that the Pennsylvania system would be unprofitable because at the Pennsylvania system, prisoners are engaged in craft style labor, those chair making, cabinet making, shoe making, that sort of thing. Whereas under the Auburn system, prisoners are engaged in a factory style work, which ostensibly is much more efficient and therefore more profitable. And then finally, they argued that the Pennsylvania system would be impractical and ineffective. Impractical in the sense that they believed there was no way to build a prison that would actually prevent prisoners from talking with one another. They were sure that the prisoners would find a way to communicate, for example, through the plumbing in the cell. So as you can see in the pictures behind me, there's a flushing toilet in the cells at Eastern State Penitentiary. And so they believed that they would tap on the pipes and they would communicate that way. And so prisoners would find a way to communicate. And so the whole point of their kind of isolation would be mitigated by their kind of creative ways of finding ways to communicate with each other, and therefore be ineffective. Or alternatively, because the prisoners would have these mental and physical health issues, they would have to be released from their cells and let out into the kind of common area altogether, which again would mitigate a lot of the purposes of or the design of the kind of keeping people apart from each other. So they would see each other, they would talk. And so the whole point of keeping people apart would be unraveled by having to kind of adjust to these issues, and therefore it would be ineffective. It's not going to reduce crime. It's not going to reform prisoners. Just in a number of ways, it's not going to be an effective prison. Okay, so to give you a sense of what some of this kind of criticism looked like and how kind of vehement it was, and again, it's not just limited to the Boston Prison Discipline Society, but it was fairly widespread across the United States and across the Atlantic as well. There are critics abroad. This is a quote from the North American Review, which was a literary journal or magazine that was kind of widely circulated throughout the 19th century. So this is a quote from 1848, where the author says, "We cannot believe that even Pennsylvania will any longer allow the prison at Philadelphia with its annual train of horrors to cast an opprobrium on the justice and humanity of the state." So that's pretty intense criticism. And of course, the prison at Philadelphia, they're referring to Eastern State Penitentiary. So the question for my book is, why does Eastern State Penitentiary retain its unique and highly criticized approach to incarceration? So, by the end of the Civil War, they're the only prison using this approach. And throughout this entire period, they're intensely criticized. So what's going on? How do they do it? Why do they do it? Okay, so to answer this question, I looked at a variety of sources. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I want to highlight that I'm looking at sources across the local, state, national, and international level. And I'm also looking across sources that are both publicly facing or public facing, so things that are intended for a wide audience to be read, as well as private documents that they assumed that nobody was reading or that they didn't want people to read. So you kind of get this sense of like what they want people to think, as well as what's actually going on, as well as a lot of kind of private thoughts about what's going on at the prison. And I'm also getting documents from people who were involved running the prison, as well as people who were kind of interested in the prison, such as local penal reformers and other regulators. The penal reformers were often kind of regulating the prison, but as well as politicians and other onlookers. So a wide variety of sources. And in answering this question, I was kind of interested in a number of explanations that other people had suggested to me throughout. So it was interesting because, like, as far as I can tell, nobody had really addressed this question. There was one kind of aside, like not extensively answer, not an extensive answer to this question in one book. But for the most part, this wasn't a question that anybody was really interested in. And I think that's because everybody kind of thought it was obvious, the answer. And the obvious answer is usually one of these explanations. So for example, a lot of people just assume that Eastern State Penitentiary kept its Pennsylvania system because, well, Quakers. So what does that mean? Well, Philadelphia is a Quaker city. Pennsylvania is a Quaker state. Quakers like solitary confinement, according to some of these claims. Therefore, the Quakers, somehow involved were basically kept solitary confinement. Or alternatively, that the prison was so expensive to build. It was so big. So it was one of the most expensive public works projects in the country at the time, kind of rivaling some of the construction in DC, and even more kind of technologically advanced than the White House, for example. So because it was so expensive, they were basically locked in. They kind of had to stick with the Pennsylvania system because the architecture was based on the Pennsylvania system. Or kind of more theoretically, there's this idea of path dependence. Basically, once you're on a particular course, it's really hard to get off that course. And so for a variety of reasons, you're just kind of locked in to that particular outcome. So basically, once they started using the Pennsylvania system, it's going to be really hard to stop using the Pennsylvania system. Or another explanation that people have offered is maybe it would just be too embarrassing to get rid of the Pennsylvania system. After all, the Pennsylvania system is the namesake of, its namesake is the state. So like, wouldn't it be kind of embarrassing for Pennsylvania to eventually have to adopt, the Auburn system, essentially the New York system? So there's that possibility. Others have offered the idea that maybe there was just one particular person in charge for a long time, and maybe they were especially committed to the Pennsylvania system. And so they kind of personally were in charge of keeping it going. And then finally, maybe it's the case that the people basically responsible for keeping the Pennsylvania system going, whether that's the prison administrators or the local penal reformers, the state legislature, that they were just essentially true believers. They believed that the Pennsylvania system was the only or the best way to do incarceration. And so maybe that's it. So when I looked into these various explanations, I found that each one was either inaccurate in certain key respects or an insufficient explanation. In a lot of ways, we can find, looking at, for example, New Jersey and Rhode Island, we can find pretty obvious exceptions where these forces weren't sufficient for keeping the Pennsylvania system around. After all, it was abandoned at those places as well. And as I was going through the research, I realized that one of the things that each of these explanations doesn't give enough attention to, or kind of sets aside, is the difficulty of retaining the Pennsylvania system. That it was actually really difficult, both kind of as a practical matter for implementing it, but also as a personal matter for the men in charge of implementing it and maintaining it. And so I argue that we have to take seriously that aspect of deviance in maintaining the Pennsylvania system. So I break down this question of how the Eastern State Penitentiary retained the Pennsylvania system into a couple of different questions that I'll talk about today. So how did Eastern become deviant in the first place? How was Eastern able to maintain its deviance? How did Eastern end its deviance? Because at a certain point, it had to come to an end. And then how does all of this help us understand prisons today? And so I want to clarify something at the moment. So I refer to Eastern kind of as this monolith thing, but actually really, when we talk about organizations, we're really talking about the people who run them. And the people who ran Eastern were Eastern's administrators. And what or sometimes in the primary sources, they refer to them as the officers of the prison. And so this broke down into a rotating cast of men who basically were part of this organizational hierarchy or prison hierarchy. So at the top was the Board of Inspectors, this group of kind of voluntary people who were appointed by the governor and eventually by the Supreme Court to essentially supervise the prisons, set its rules, kind of appoint other people to fill the remaining offices and so on. Next, we have the warden, who's kind of our typical idea of the prison warden, the person in charge. So he answers to the Board of Inspectors, but he kind of runs the prison on a day-to-day basis, administers punishment, does kind of deals with staff issues, basically below him, and deals with the kind of labor of the prisoners and so on. Then we have the staff physician, who is in this kind of awkward position where he's sort of able to overrule the warden on certain health issues, but at the same time is not actually as in charge as the warden, who kind of has general control of the prison. And then finally, we have the moral instructor, which is kind of like the minister on staff for the prison. So all of these people, maybe not so much for the moral instructor, but all of these people are economically comfortable. I would even say social elites within mostly Philadelphia. They're mostly US born and they're all white men. They're all white and they're all men. And they're basically, again, these social elites. So it's kind of weird to think about prisons run by social elites, but that's something that happened in the late 18th and early 19th century, kind of throughout the 19th century. So that's kind of who these people are. And just to kind of give you one face to look at, over here we have Richard Box, who is a very important inspector, the longest lasting inspector at Eastern State Penitentiary. And here's the connection to the Athenaeum. His father, Robert Box, well-known philanthropist, was actually a treasurer of the Athenaeum, and I believe left a sizable donation to it when he passed. And he was also an inspector at Eastern State Penitentiary. It was kind of a family business for them. Okay, so the other thing I want to point out is these administrators basically are central to the explanation of how does Eastern maintain its deviance? How does it keep the Pennsylvania system despite all the difficulties associated with it? Going into this project, I really expected it would be the penal reformers or it would be the legislators. That's kind of what we're taught to expect when we think about penal reform and when we study it and when we work in activist circles. It's essentially it's the reformers / activists or it's the people in charge, the politicians. But actually, it turns out that the prison administrators are incredibly important to the story of Eastern State Penitentiary. Okay, so now I want to talk about how Eastern State Penitentiary became deviant, because it didn't start out that way. Okay, so this is a very brief timeline. I'm going to unpack it, but I kind of want to run through it first just to give you a sense of like, how did this happen in a thumbnail sketch? So recall that in the 1810s or so, this is the period of the proto-prisons. In the 1810s, the proto-prisons start to fail drastically. There are a number of riots at the prisons that are very scary for the people at the time. There's a crime wave. People think that the proto-prisons are to blame and that they're basically failing. And so as part of the kind of conversation of what do we do next? Do we go back to capital punishment and instead of incarceration? Like, what do we do? Instead, people start rallying around the idea of solitary confinement. They say we need bigger, stronger, more tightly controlled prisons, and central to that is going to be solitary confinement. In fact, the first wave of prisons, those first generation proto prisons, they were supposed to use solitary confinement, but we ended up actually not doing that. So, we need to go back to the basics. We need to use solitary confinement. That's going to fix the problem. So a couple of prisons, including Western State Penitentiary, do actually open up these new modern prisons on a solitary confinement model. And at this point, solitary confinement means somebody is in their cell, usually a fairly small cell, for the duration of their sentence with nothing to do. So they don't have any reading material, or sometimes they're given a Bible, they're not given any work, and they're not given any way to leave their cell. They have to stay in this fairly small cell for the duration of their confinement. And as you might expect, this turns pretty badly. So at these early prisons that adopt solitary confinement, they start to have mental and physical health problems with the prisoners so confined. And at first, nobody knows about this. So like a lot of these experiments kind of go away quietly. And then years later, it leaks out, or there's a report and people find out. So in 1825 and 1826, there's a series of reports where people find out that total solitary confinement led to suicide attempts, self-harm, massive amounts of illness, and other very bad outcomes. And so that went really badly. At the same time, that Boston Prison Discipline Society is founded, and they start engaging in this discussion about what should we do about solitary confinement. Okay, so as this is happening, at the same time, kind of in the background, the Auburn system is starting to be adopted at other modern prisons. So more states are interested in modern prisons. And so even before the solitary confinement news breaks out, states have either authorized or adopted modern prisons, and they're increasingly interested in the Auburn system. And so that's kind of happening in the background. And then this discussion about solitary confinement is also happening as people are debating what these new modern prisons should look like. Okay, so then in 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary opens, and it's the first prison to be opened officially on what becomes the Pennsylvania system, that system of solitary for the duration, but with labor as well as visitation from the prison staff and local penal reformers. I forgot to mention that earlier. So it's kind of like solitary plus. It's not this total restrictive solitary confinement. It's like a nice solitary confinement is how they conceived of it. So despite initial skepticism that the solitary confinement used was going to result in similar problems along the lines of those four criticisms that I mentioned that actually had manifested at these other prisons. And after just a couple of years, pretty quickly, the penal reformers, including the Boston Prison Discipline Society, warmly received the Pennsylvania system. And in fact, they saw it as basically a variation on the Auburn system. So there's these reports where they would count how many prisons had adopted the Auburn system, and they included the Pennsylvania system in those reports because they thought it was sufficiently similar. They just thought it was like a minor variation. So that's how undeviant Eastern State Penitentiary was at the very beginning. It was just basically a variation on the theme. We're all using labor, we're all using solitary confinement to some extent, and we're all using social exclusion and those sorts of things. So it's basically not that different. Okay, so that changes about 5 years later. The state legislature investigates a series of wrongdoings at Eastern State Penitentiary. So there's word of embezzlement happening, that some of the administrators are embezzling, that they're torturing the prisoners, and the prisoner died, and another one went insane following this torture. And they're also investigating violations of the Pennsylvania system, that the prison officials are taking prisoners out of their cells, for example, and allowing them to work around the prison in violation of the official separate system or Pennsylvania system. Okay, so once that investigation leaks out, then all of those earlier criticisms come back and people say, I knew it, I knew they're going to have to take people out of their cells and they're going to have to adjust. I knew that this was going to happen. Look at how terrible this is. And pretty quickly, the Pennsylvania system is seen as this problematic approach. At this point, I should also note that more than half of the states that have a modern prison are now following the Auburn system. So again, the Auburn system is just kind of steadily chugging along, kind of taking over prisons across the country. Meanwhile, the Pennsylvania system is just kind of like trying to get started, trying to get kind of a foothold, and it's struggling with all these various issues. Okay, so that's kind of the brief timeline, but I want to highlight some major themes that kind of are informing the discussions and the criticisms that are happening. So one is just the anxiety that people felt at the time by people, I mean the penal reformers, the prison administrators, as well as the politicians in charge, the legislatures and governors and so on. So there's a lot of anxiety around the time because the prison is so new. So again, we didn't have prisons before the American Revolution. We didn't have long-term confinement. This is our only second generation of prisons. And so there's a lot of anxiety about what happens when we put people in boxes. And these basically boil down to both philosophical and pragmatic concerns. So one is like physically and mentally, can we put humans in long-term captivity in like the cellular confinement? Is that possible? Is it healthy? Related to that, is it morally justified? Like, are we allowed to do that, especially in the New Republic? Are we allowed to take somebody's liberty like that? And then finally, will it actually be effective? If the prisons fail, at some point, maybe the Republic is also going to fail because we need virtuous citizens, and prisons are supposed to help people become virtuous citizens. They're supposed to reform them from criminals into virtuous citizens. If this isn't effective, this is really potentially bad for the country and for the fate of the Republic. So, will it even work? There's a lot of concern that, especially putting somebody in solitary confinement, for example, if they're a hardened criminal, they might just kind of be fine for the duration. Whereas if somebody's kind of like a new criminal and they're kind of like soft and at heart, they could be reformed, they might be immensely tortured. So the hardened criminal would be fine, but the kind of soft new criminal is just going to wilt under the pressure. And so there was a lot of concern about just what's going to happen, again, because everything is so new. So to give you an example of what some of this anxiety looked like in terms of the pamphlets that were circulated, this is a British pamphlet from a penal reformer, William Roscoe, who's engaging in this debate at a time when solitary confinement is still very popular in the United States, and it's actually seen as the American system. People sometimes refer to it as the American system. So again, solitary used to be really popular. And so he's criticizing it from a British perspective and saying, like, Americans, you need to watch what you're doing. So he says, to be shut up in a cell for days, weeks, months, and years alone, to be deprived of converse with a fellow human being, to have no friendly voice to minister consolation, no friendly bosom on which to lean or into which to pour our sorrows and complaints, but on the contrary, to count the tedious hours as they pass, a prey to the corrodings of conscience and the pangs of guilt, is almost to become a victim of despair. So this is one of a number of quotations that he had in 3 different treatises where he's criticizing solitary confinement as this is cruel, this is inhumane, this is bad, this is not how we should be designing our new prisons. England certainly shouldn't copy this, and the United States should rethink what they're doing. Or to give you a more local perspective on this, so one of the inspectors at Eastern State Penitentiary, Thomas Bradford, during the investigation, the legislative investigation into the prison, he's reflecting back on the early days of the Pennsylvania system, only a few years before his testimony. And he explains, the experiment of separate confinement by day and night was about to be made. Good men had doubts. None of us could say how far the body and mind could be in total seclusion from society and confinement to a cell for a length of time. So again, this concern about what happens to the body and mind of a person. And again, like, is it okay? Are they going to die? Are they going to go insane? Is it okay for us to do this? Like, what's going on? What's going to happen? So just a profound anxiety kind of underlying these new, what they refer to as experiments with incarceration or long-term confinement. Okay, so there's another kind of element that's egging on their anxiety, again, because of the novelty, but also in this case, because past experiments failed. So throughout this point, we're about 50 years into a series of just massive penal reform movements from like just before the American Revolution to the 1820s, where we had a series of penal reforms that we tried and that failed miserably. So for example, in Philadelphia and a number of other cities on the East Coast, there were a series of experiments with public labor where instead of sentencing somebody to death, they would sentence them to essentially public work. So they would do like street sweeping or public works on the street, kind of building, things or helping to build roads and things like that publicly with like literally a ball and chain on their ankle, so that they could that they couldn't escape, although that didn't actually stop them from escaping. Then after that failed, we decided public labor doesn't work, but we like the idea of labor, so let's try incarceration with labor. So we get those first generation prisons, and by the 1810s, those have also failed. And then we have the modern prisons, and the first version of the modern prisons use that total solitary confinement that also failed very miserably with the very bad outcomes to people's mental and physical health. And so we have this like series of failures just over and over, one after another. But it's not just that each effort at penal reform had failed miserably. And this is on the heels of deciding that capital punishment was also a failure, by the way. It's not just that, it's that each of these major penal reforms were things that people had really high expectations for. They thought this is going to solve it. This is going to fix crime. This is going to be great. This is humane. This is a very American solution. This is fantastic. But it's not just that they had high expectations. It's also that initially the first results were, this is fantastic. This is going great. So Walnut Street Prison, for example, in Philadelphia, which was essentially the model for the country for the proto prisons, the initial reviews of Walnut Street, both from people who worked there as well as people who visited, talked about how fantastic a prison it was, that it was profitable, that they were no longer taking money from the state, but they were self-sustaining, that the prisoners were not sick. That was a big problem with confinement historically. The prisoners were able to survive, and there was a yellow fever outbreak in the city, very famously in 1784, and the prison survived without any illness. Just across the board, it was fantastic. And then so when it turns out that all of that wasn't true, or like maybe it was true initially, but very quickly that went away, it was, this kind of whiplash of like, wait, you said this was going well, and now we're finding out it's actually going very, very badly. Same thing with the experiments with total solitary confinement. At first, we're getting glowing praise, glowing results, everything's going great. And then we find out how badly it's going. And I think this combination, this whiplash of high expectations, early positive results, combined with the kind of finding out that actually these are failing miserably, like very, very badly, created a lot of uncertainty and more anxiety about the next generation of penal reforms, the next experiments, especially the ones with very high hopes, which of course we had for the modern prisons. Okay, so I apologize, this is a little graphic, but I want to give you an example of just how bad some of this was. So this is an excerpt from one of those reports that I mentioned that came out in 1825 and 1826, this one from 1826, and it was written by the prison's agent, which is kind of like a warden, but that's the term that they used at Auburn State Prison. So this isn't the Auburn system, just to clarify, but the Auburn State Prison started off with solitary confinement as well as the Auburn system, and for different populations of prisoners. So the prison's agent reported about the failure of solitary confinement, and he says, one prisoner was so desperate that he sprang from his cell when the door was opened and threw himself from the gallery upon the pavement. Another beat and mangled his head against the walls of his cell until he destroyed one of his eyes. So reports like this were common from the few other prisons that adopted the system of total solitary confinement, and a lot of them were just as graphic. So it was really, really bad. And again, the initial reports was that this had gone fine, it was great, solitary is wonderful. Okay, so returning to that brief timeline. So again, solitary confinement is very popular. People think it's going to be the solution to the failure of the proto prisons. We're going to adopt these bigger, stronger, more tightly controlled modern prisons that are going to rely on solitary confinement. But we find out that total solitary confinement is problematic, but we're not so going to distance ourselves from solitary confinement completely, because we still like the Auburn system, which is going to use solitary confinement, but just at night. And so we're going to say that's okay. Solitary confinement just at night is okay. Total solitary confinement is not okay. In Pennsylvania, they say, well, we don't want to do total solitary confinement, and we're not just going to do it at night. So we're going to do kind of solitary confinement plus. We're going to give people work. We're going to give them visitation. We're going to take steps to make sure that the bad things that happened at these other prisons doesn't happen here. We're going to build extra big cells with ventilation and so on. And then we get that investigation into the wrongdoings at Eastern State Penitentiary. And now everybody turns against the Pennsylvania system. Not literally everybody, but like a lot of people. And so to give you an example, so again, a lot of pamphlets were exchanged. We have those criticisms. So here's an example of one of the criticisms coming from the Boston Prison Discipline Society. So like many societies at the time, they had these annual reports. And as part of their annual reports, they would basically look at what was happening at other prisons, and they were especially interested in what was happening at Eastern. So every year they would cull through Eastern's annual reports, and they would basically summarize the worst findings from those annual reports. And so in this case, this is the 1839 annual report from the Boston Prison Discipline Society, reporting on the annual report from Eastern State Penitentiary. So they say, the 10th report on the Eastern Penitentiary by the inspectors, warden, and physician is in excuses and opinions very fair, but in facts awful. 402 prisoners, 26 deaths, 23 recommitments, 18 cases of mania, etc., and expenses above earnings untold by the government of the prison, but disclosed by the treasurer of the Commonwealth to be the amount of $34,368 in a single year, not adjusted for inflation, of course, in today's dollars. So this is a pretty hefty amount. Okay, so we have this intense kind of criticism of the Pennsylvania system, especially at Eastern State Penitentiary, which becomes the lightning rod for this deviance. So how do they do it? How do they maintain the deviance, and why? Why do they do it? Okay, so they basically rely on a series of strategies, basically boiling down to two big families of strategies. So one is they had these kind of hidden strategic manipulations of the Pennsylvania system where they try to prevent the bad outcomes that they're being criticized for. So we don't want bad mental health outcomes. We don't want more prisoner deaths. We don't want to have like really big losses in our finances. So they're going to do things that kind of change how the Pennsylvania system was implemented to avoid having those really bad outcomes. And then on the flip side, more publicly, so they didn't talk about that publicly, but publicly they would defend the Pennsylvania system to try to counter those criticisms of the Pennsylvania system, as well as of themselves, because they were also pretty heavily criticized. And I argue that they use these strategies to basically prevent incursions into the Pennsylvania system. So the local penal reformers, as well as the legislature, kept trying to like inch in and kind of take over control and change how they were doing things there. And so they would use this to maintain control, but also importantly to reassure themselves that they were doing the right thing. Okay, so here are a couple of examples of some of those strategic manipulations of the Pennsylvania system. So for example, they would double cell prisoners whose mental or physical health was declining. So I won't read these examples now for the sake of time, but basically anytime that there was a prisoner who, seemed like they were going downhill mentally or physically, they would find another prisoner to stay in the same cell with them. So they would have company under the idea that what's the problem is that people need physical or social contact. And so if you give them social contact, that's going to alleviate some of the kind of mental decompensation, essentially. Another strategy that they used was to have prisoners do work assignments outside of their cells. So again, this was a huge violation of the Pennsylvania system, just like double celling was. In this case, the problem was if prisoners are working outside of their cells, they might see each other, a guard might see them. They're not in their masks the whole time. And they also might run into one another and have conversations. All of this is bad for reformation because they believe that prisoners could essentially pollute each other and drag them more into criminality. So we don't want to do that. And so instead, they would do this because they thought it would help to save them money. And it seems to have done so pretty well. But this is also very much what the administrators believed that they were doing. So again, I'm not going to read this one just for the sake of time, but they explicitly saw this as a way of protecting the finances of the prison. Okay. So the other thing I want to talk about here is the way in which they were criticized themselves. So in addition to those 4 standard criticisms, kind of implicit in all of this and sometimes explicit was that the people who are carrying out the system are bad. So this is a very, Charles Dickens very famously visited Eastern State Penitentiary in 1842, and he hated it. Apparently not while he visited, but later when he published his memoirs about his travels through America, he devotes an entire chapter to Eastern State Penitentiary and how horrible it is. And so there are many very quotable passages. So I just want to give you a flavor with this one. In its intention, I am well convinced that it is kind, humane, and meant for reformation. But I am persuaded that those who devise this system of prison discipline and those benevolent gentlemen who carry it into execution do not know what it is that they are doing. I believe that very few men are capable of estimating the immense amount of torture and agony which this dreadful punishment prolonged for years inflicts upon the sufferers. And this quote, this actually really got to the prison administrators. So just by kind of pointing out that they don't know what it is that they're doing, this isn't a special dig at them, because they believed that they were doing, not only good work, but they were also claiming that they were experts in prison discipline and how to run prisons. This was something that they claimed kind of throughout the period. They also referred to themselves as benevolent gentlemen. This was like almost like a catchphrase at the time. And so they saw what they were doing as benevolent. It was a huge theme in their public writings, that's who they were. So basically, by calling them out in this way, Dickens was really kind of hitting them where it hurts. And on top of that, it's not just kind of a theoretical expectation, like it really did aggravate them. So when the book came out, they discussed it amongst themselves privately. They're very upset about it. And they were so upset about it that like 30 years later, when there's a different crop of administrators at the helm of Eastern State Penitentiary, they're still complaining about Dickens and how unfair it was that he visited the prison, didn't express any discontent, said that he liked the system, and then kind of went back and published this scathing review of the Pennsylvania system. Okay, so basically, I argue in the book that a lot of this criticism kind of personally affected the men who ran Eastern State Penitentiary, all those administrators. And so they had to do something to kind of stave off the years of dealing with this public criticism of what they're doing. And they were able to stave it off in part by essentially by defending the prison. They used a series of defenses against these criticisms, and these map onto something that we see in the field of criminology when people are looking at either deviants or people who have committed crime more generally, and how they kind of square their self-identity as a good person, like I'm a good person and yet I committed crime. So how do you reconcile those two things? And so going back to the 1950s, scholars found that basically people come up with these accounts of themselves and their behavior to kind of justify what they're doing, so they can still see themselves as good people, but also at the same time can kind of justify their criminality. So I see these happen at Eastern as well in the annual reports that they propagated. And so the administrators, for example, would evaluate the Pennsylvania system. They would look through and they would say like, oh, look, we actually didn't have that many deaths this year, or the number of deaths we had is basically around the same amount as they had at the Auburn State Prison or other Auburn system prisons. So like we're basically in the distribution. We're not that bad of a prison. Like we're actually not a bad prison. And so they would kind of go through and look at all the things that they're criticized of, and they would present data showing people that they were better than the criticism was suggesting. But of course, the data didn't always fall in their favor. And so when that happened, they would sometimes engage in scapegoating. So they would kind of horrifically blame the prisoners. So this is a small excerpt where they are reviewing the number of deaths that happened in the prison and the causes of those deaths. And so they would say, it is worthy of remark that 4 out of the 5 fatal cases occurred in prisoners who entered the penitentiary in a diseased state, and that the deaths in all cases took place after a short period of confinement. Basically, they came in sick, they were going to die anyway. And in fact, it was such a short period of confinement, the system didn't even have a chance to like hurt them. So it can't possibly be us. It wasn't us. They would also talk about what they're doing as very good for the prison as well as for society and the prisoners. So these positive characterizations. And then my favorite, they would also criticize their critics. They would seek to undermine them. So they would say things like, supporters of the Auburn system criticize us because we're, torturing our prisoners with solitary confinement. But guess what? They're whipping people as part of their explicit punishments. And that's a lot worse than what we're doing. Or they would say things like, the Auburn system supporters are driven by profit motivations, but we would never be driven by anything so unseemly as profit and loss. And so these would go throughout their annual reports to basically counteract this criticism, to protect the prison. And sorry, my timer just went off, to protect the prison. And also I argue to protect themselves from kind of dealing with this ongoing criticism. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up because I'm kind of running late on time. So I'm gonna go ahead and skip that. Okay, sorry, I had a lot more to cover. Okay, so to conclude, I argue that basically Eastern's administrators were committed to the Pennsylvania system in part because they were able to claim that they were basically really good, that they were running the best prison out there, that they were running this far humane benevolent prison, and that they themselves, in doing so, were also benevolent, excellent gentlemen as well. So very briefly, kind of thinking about how this impacts today. So one is just kind of paying attention to the importance of the anxieties people had about penal reform at the time. So back when prisons were new and what it means to put human beings in long-term confinement, kind of taking seriously that anxiety and kind of stepping back and thinking like, where did that go? Why did that anxiety stop at a certain point? And part of the answer to that is basically at a certain point, people decided good enough is good enough. There are only so many people who die in prison every year. And so like 26 deaths is fine. That's a livable number. Whereas, before that would have been astronomical and just mind boggling, and, they would have stopped it. But after a while, they're like, compared to the death rate under solitary confinement, 26 really isn't bad. So we can move on. So kind of how that process happened, and then just kind of thinking about how we acclimated to the horrors that happen when people are incarcerated for long periods of time. And also kind of related to this, thinking about how quickly we as a society and the people who are interested in penal reform move from the question of whether we should incarcerate people, whether the prison is a good idea, to questions about how should we design the prison, how should we implement the prison. And this is something we continue to see quite often, where we focus on how the prison is designed. So for example, there's a lot of talk about copying the Swedish model and so on. So there's a lot of focus on designing the prison, but not kind of thinking about the larger question about the prison itself. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ashley. I think that obviously here's a, not being able to get through everything is good because it gives an opportunity for people to pick up your book. But we have some questions here. First, James is wondering if you, in your research, you learned anything about the spread of communicable diseases. What was the comparison between Auburn and the Pennsylvania systems? Which obviously is a question that it's meaningful today in our time.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, so communicable diseases is a huge, important question. So it's actually interesting. So the more interesting answer I can give you is actually not about Eastern State Penitentiary, but about 50 years earlier, when we're transitioning from colonial jails and kind of reforming them, and then that led to the first prisons. So colonial jails were these overcrowded, basically usually like one-room buildings that were not cleaned. They were basically not regulated, not controlled. There was a jailer that wasn't employed by the colony or the state. They were paid by fees and fines. They didn't provide clothing. They sold food and grog to the prisoners. And the prison was filled with people, or sorry, the jail. The jail was filled with a huge mix of people, from debtors and vagrants, their family members, to people awaiting trial who hadn't been convicted, people who had been convicted, but were awaiting their punishment, or people who had been punished but still owed fees and fines. So huge mix of people, children, old people, men, women, just basically a mix of society. And these were heavily diseased places. So very famously in England, where colonial jails were very similar, they called them county prisons in England, or jails with a G. Very famously, a number of these places were filled with so much disease that when people came out to court for trial, they infected the entire courtroom and hundreds of people would die. And there are a couple of like really notable cases of this. And these were used to help justify the jail reform movement that eventually led to the first prisons. And so the cleanliness of the prison was incredibly important at the time. And so for Walnut Street Prison, for example, that I mentioned, one of their kind of claims to fame was that they had a very strict cleaning regimen. They would, whitewash the walls on a regular basis. They changed the bedding. They used fresh straw. Just all these things, and they treated prisoners' illnesses and so on, and that mattered a lot to them. And so this is a moment that's, especially in the current context, really kind of striking, because we tried so hard to prevent the spread of disease in those early reform jails and the proto prisons. And then in the modern prisons, we had staff physicians, and they would visit the prisoners on a weekly basis, just all these things to try to prevent the spread of disease. They also inoculated prisoners. That was something that they did do at Eastern State Penitentiary. Anytime there was like a smallpox epidemic, they would go through and they would inoculate everybody. So there is a really big emphasis on preventing disease in a way that I think we could learn a thing or two today. Yeah.
Thank you. So Graham, as I mentioned before, is part of the Friends of Lafayette, and notes that when the Marquis de Lafayette visited Philadelphia in 1825, he visited the then under construction penitentiary, and his logic was that his 1 year against solitary confinement was that his 1 year spell in an Austrian prison had not worked, since he, quote, still wanted to revolutionize the people against despotism and aristocracy when he was released. So he was not reformed in the way that the Austrian government might have hoped that he would be. So Kay is wondering where you visited for your research. Did you go to the Athenaeum or the penitentiary?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I spent most of my time at the American Philosophical Society. They had the original written testimony from the legislative investigation. They had this wonderful diary from a penal reformer that was really helpful. They had some letters from the prisoners. They had the moral instructor's records, so a lot of stuff. I also went to the Historical Society of Philadelphia, where they have a lot of the penal reformers documents. So I would read the meeting minutes of the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, now called the Pennsylvania Prison Society. And so I was able to learn a lot about the people who ran the Penal Reform Society, some of whom actually moved over and became administrators at Eastern as well. And then I also went to the state archives at Harrisburg, to get some of the materials that I couldn't find otherwise. And then a lot of stuff was online. So there's a lot of penal reform documents are online. And as I was mentioning earlier, there a lot of the Eastern State Penitentiary annual reports are also available now through Google Books. And so you can actually read a lot of the reports, and those were especially central to my my research. There's a lot of different places that I went to, and a lot of online research by the end. I was saying earlier that, like, in the beginning, it was like you had to go to an archive, and now there's a lot of stuff online as well. And so that kind of transformed over the course of my research. But I still have to, there's still some things in other archives that I would like to go to and learn more. Yeah.
So we have one last question. I think we have time. Mary Frances asked a question, which I think is interesting, because it's, I think, something that people often say today about jail and prison. I'm wondering if people at that time would get themselves into a prison to get food and a roof over their heads.
Excellent question. So that was definitely a concern with the proto prisons. In fact, there was a concern among penal reformers that actually prostitutes would get themselves arrested in order to sell their wares inside the jails. But actually at Eastern, once we got the modern prisons, it's not clear to me that we have any cases of people who actually explicitly committed crimes to get incarcerated, at least not at the state prison level, maybe at the jails. But I didn't review those documents as closely. But what was really striking, there are two things that were really striking. One was the efforts that the administrators made to help people re-enter society. So they would help find them jobs. They would help make sure that they had places to live. And a lot of times they would let them stay on at the prison for a couple of days or weeks if they wanted. Sometimes to wait for new clothes to be made because their clothes had just turned to shreds when they were waiting. So they needed new clothes, or they wanted to earn a little extra cash before they went out into society. So at the time, prisoners were paid for their work in prison and a fairly good wage. And so they could even stay a couple of extra days to kind of increase that amount. But the most striking thing and the most relevant part to your question is prisoners would sometimes come back to Eastern State Penitentiary, and they would say, you know what, can you let me stay here for, like, a couple of months, or at least for the winter season, because I'm not finding work out here. Can you just take me back? And they would take them back. They would put them in an empty cell. This is all before the Civil War. As far as I know, they didn't do this after the Civil War because overcrowding was too bad. But that actually happened. They would let prisoners come back so that they could have a steady place to be. So.
Fascinating. And Greg, I know you probably were going to get to this if you hadn't run out of time. So if you could briefly say something about how Eastern State finally ended the PA system.
Yeah, thank you. So there's not one answer to this question, because arguably it never actually used the Pennsylvania system. So as soon as they got their first prisoner, they were already deviating from the Pennsylvania system. Officially, it came to an end in 1913 by legislative action. So there's a statute that authorizes them to not to copy the Auburn system, interestingly enough, but to allow multiple prisoners in the same cell and basically end solitary confinement officially. But at that point, they hadn't been using solitary confinement for about 40 years. So basically, another answer to the question is 1866. So at the end of the Civil War, number of people going to prison skyrockets, and Eastern starts having too many people in prison, and they don't have enough room for one person per cell. They beg the legislature for relief, either to move some prisoners to Western or to grant them money to build an extension of the prison so they could have more cells. The legislature is unmoved. It takes them like a full 10, 15 years to actually act on that. And of course, it takes a while to build. And so I argue the actual end happens in the 1870s, because throughout that period of overcrowding, the administrators are constantly trying to save the Pennsylvania system, and they're still talking about how good the Pennsylvania system is. But over the course of the 1870s, they're quietly kind of eating away at the Pennsylvania system. So they allow prisoners access to newspapers. They occasionally let a family member come in to visit the prisoners. These things were forbidden beforehand. And by the end of this decade, they no longer refer to separate confinement, which had been like a mainstay. And instead they start talking about individual treatment. It's the individual treatment system. So there's never an official moment where the Pennsylvania system is over. It's this very gradual evolution, almost like a sleight of hand. And they never come out and say like, we ended it. It's just this kind of, because it's kind of embarrassing at that point. And so it's this very gradual move away from the Pennsylvania system over the course of the 1870s. So those are the many answers to when did the Pennsylvania system end.
Thank you, Ashley Rubin, for a fascinating talk about Eastern State Penitentiary and models of prisons and prison reform. Again, if anybody wants the book, you can probably check it out from UPenn. I'm guessing their copy may be available, maybe not. If you want our copy, tell Jill and she'll bug me to finish it so you can get it. You can also purchase it online or in a bookstore. Our next program coming up will be with Jill Desmini about Philadelphia and 350 years of hydrology. So continue to learn about our city and its design and plans. We were a leader in water systems. So this is another way to keep learning about Philadelphia. Thank you so much for joining us all. Hope you all have a wonderful evening. Stay cool and think about those waves in Hawaii where Dr. Rubin is right now. Good to see you all, and thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.